Yay! Okay, cool. So yeah, the plan for the rest of this time is, again, I have a few more kind of notions I want to get across to you, some definitions I want to pitch at you, and then we'll talk a little bit about symbolizing, and we'll all go home happy. So that's the plan. So, I should also mention something about the structure of the slides. You'll notice whenever I give a definition, I try and put it in these blue boxes. So if you see one of these kinds of things, this is something where I might ask you that on one of the exams. Don't worry, I'll give you a kind of version of the exams as we get closer so you can see some of them, but they'll always be structured on the slides like this, so it's obvious. You can tab through real fast to find them. Try and color code things for people's convenience. Okay, so here are two other notions that are very helpful for us. They're related to validity. And in fact, we've already talked a little bit about them already. Right? It seems like some sentences are such, lots of S's there, that it's impossible for them to be true together. As an example, just take 1 and 2 here. Amanda is taller than Bert. Bert is taller than Amanda. If we don't equivocate, that is, if we don't change what we mean about Amanda, Bert, and is taller than, there's no way for 1 and 2 to both be true. They might be the same height, in which case, cool, they're both false. Or Amanda might be taller, or Bert might be taller, or maybe one of them doesn't exist. In which case, well, they're probably, I don't know, one of them's true and the other's false. Easy to be taller than 0. So to kind of flesh out this idea of sentences that are not possibly true together, we can come up with some notions. So we'll say some sentences are jointly consistent if and only if it's possible to make them all true together. And some sentences are jointly inconsistent if and only if it's impossible for them all to be true together. Now note, some key words in these definitions are all together. So if we're assessing some sentences to figure out if they're consistent, we need to try and make them all true, all at the same time. Similarly, if we're assessing whether they're inconsistent, we need to see if there's no possible way for us to make them all true, all at the same time. We've already seen some inconsistent sentences. When was that? Mars's moons, right? The Mars's moons premises. And in fact, we already saw some interesting connections between joint inconsistency and validity. Whenever premises are jointly inconsistent, argument is guaranteed to be valid. That's the cheap way to guarantee validity, one of the two. Okay, but that's about sentences taken as groups. We might think about sentences by themselves. It seems sometimes sentences have a different kind of grip on truth. So this is my old dog, Yabka. I keep her in the slides for, this sort of little memory here. So it seems like some sentences are such that they have to be true. And some sentences are such that they have to be false. And then there are some which could be true or could be false. So for example, here's our first one. Yabka's on the grass. This seems like it could be true, as in the picture, or it could be false, as is the case now. She's not on the grass right now. Okay, so again, we kind of see this idea. Some sentences could be true, they could be false. The mug is black. Sure, but I could paint it. That sentence could be true, or it could be false. Contrast that with our second sentence here. Either Yabka's fully on the grass, or is not fully on the grass. Now what's interesting about this sentence is it looks like simply by its structure, it has to be true. Because either she's fully on the grass, Or it's not the case that she's fully on the grass. That could be because she's, say, partially off of it, or it could be because she does not exist. There could be lots of reasons why the second disjunct could be true, but it looks like it's either going to go one way or the other. Yes?
If she's not on the grass at all, would that fall under not fully on the grass?
Yeah. So again, we're reading fully here as like entirely. There's no part of her that's not. Something like that. Again, can we sort of see how the structure here looks like it's going to guarantee it's got to be one way or the other? Again, we might quibble about the case. We can hopefully get the intuitive idea. Take our last one. Yabka's both fully on and not fully on the grass. Well, given the assumption we talked about a second ago, that don't look like it can happen. I mean, even if we drop the no gluts assumption, it's very hard for me to even think of a way to make this coherent. This looks like the sort of sentence that must be false, simply in virtue of its structure, because it's saying P and not P. Again, we can quibble about the case, but hopefully you can see the basic idea. Some look like they hold on to truth no matter what. Some look like they hold on to falsity no matter what, and some look like they can go one way or the other. So let's give some definitions. We'll say a sentence is a necessary truth if and only if it's true, and it's not possibly false. That is, it's not just true, but it's always true. Similarly, we can say a sentence is a necessary falsehood if and only if it's false and it's not possibly true. Not only is it false, but it's always false. And then finally, we can say a sentence is contingent if and only if it's possible for the sentence to be true and it's possible for it to be false. Okay, so these are rough and ready notions. Again, they're kind of defined in terms of truth and possibility. We're going to develop some machinery that will let us understand them slightly better. But at least right off the bat, it's helpful for us to get a grip on these ideas. Okay, cool. Questions on these or about consistency and inconsistency? Kind of a rough and ready idea so far? We'll talk a little bit more about these in the tutorials. We'll do some exercises to think about them. But again, what's important for us now is just to kind of have it in our back pocket, because we're going to build towards really cashing them out in better ways. We at least want to know what we're aiming for first. Okay, cool. So, nice. So far, so good. What have we done? Well, we started off with this idea of trying to make sense of follows from. And the way that we did that was via notion of validity. We thought about truth, and it's something like preserving truth. Whenever the premises are true, so must the conclusion be. And we talked a little bit about validity. We looked at some arguments, in particular one that was really funny. But we kind of got a grip on this idea. Then we talked a little bit about some other background notions. So I told you, hey, we're not going to talk about all these other kinds of arguments, just deductive ones. Don't really care about non-assoteric sentences, just the assoteric ones, right? And then we actually got to the interesting things, which were notions of coherence, incoherence, necessary truth, necessary falsehood, and contingency. Again, that's all stuff we're going to characterize more fully once we have the full machinery in front of us. So far, so good. So let's start in on the first formal language. Let's start in truth functional logic. The first step, unsurprisingly, will have to be with arguments. So here's an argument. Premise 1, Yabka's asleep. Premise 2, if Yabka's asleep, then she's snoring. Conclusion, Yabka's snoring. Valid, invalid? Valid. Why is it valid? Yeah.
Oh, it's valid because the two premises are true, therefore conclusion is also true.
The fact that they are true,
The fact that they are true, the two premises are true, leads to the fact that the conclusion is true.
so it's impossible to make 1 and 2 true and 3 false, right? If 1 and 2 are true, 3's got to be as well. Again, it's always helpful to put it in terms of the definition, right? Impossible to make the premises true and the conclusion false. Cool. Okay, so it was a valid argument. How about this one? Premise 1, Yabka's awake. Premise 2, if Yabka's awake, then she's hungry. Conclusion, Yabka's hungry. She wants to eat. Valid? Invalid? We've got to be careful.
Valid.
Truth is not something we apply to arguments. Truth is something that applies to sentences, not to arguments. Arguments are valid or invalid. But it's valid. Cool, it's valid. Does this argument look familiar? Yeah, it's the same, right? It's the same structure. This one and this one, all we're really worried about is whether she's awake or asleep. Right? Basically the same argument here. Both arguments are valid, and both have the same underlying structure. Blah, blah. If blah, blah, then blue, blue. Therefore, blue, blue. No, it doesn't really matter what these are. As long as we fill them in with sentences, we know that this is going to be a valid argument. We know that it's a valid argument. Yeah. Yeah. This is a deductive argument, right? This is basically capturing a very fundamental form of deductive argument. We'll talk more about it in just a second. Okay, so cool. We might, get rid of the baby talk because I'll get sick of that really fast. And instead, we might just replace the phrases with capital letters, right? So, A, if A, then B, B. Okay? Now note, what do each capital letter here stand for? They stand for some complete sentence. So A might be Yopka's asleep, or Yopka's awake, or Nathan is fat. B might be Yopka snoring, Yopka wants to eat, Nathan should lose some weight, that's very hurtful, and I think you really should apologize. Right? Again, do we see the kind of idea here? It doesn't matter what we plug in for A and B, the argument is guaranteed to be valid. Cool. In other words, we have a structure, a schema. If we can show that a given natural language argument can be mapped onto this, we already have done the work. We know it's valid. So here's something nice. To assess the validity of an argument, at least some ways an argument can be valid, we don't even care what it says. All we need to know is that it fits this structure. If we can re-express the argument in this structure, regardless of what the A's and B's are, it's at least valid. So, this structure is actually called modus ponens, or modus ponies if you're having fun. Right? There's other good argument structures. Here's a good one. Right? We have A or B. We know it was an A, so it must be B. I know we went down the alleyway or went up the fire escape. Well, the alleyway is blocked with a bin. We must have gone up the fire escape. Here's another one. If we already know that it's not A and B, and we know that A is the case, we know B ain't. And the last one, we'll talk more about this in the tutorial. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. This is called modus tollens. And don't worry too much about these. Yes?
Can you give an example for the second one?
Yeah. So suppose we know that it's not the case that I had beer and wine, but we know that I bought a bunch of beer. What must have happened? I didn't have any wine. That's the kind of idea. Right? If we know it's not both, not both, and we know that it was this one, it must not be the other one. It's kind of another version of this. Yes?
But right now we're not talking about validity.
We are, right? So how does validity come back to these? Where does validity get in?
Because the premises, no, the conclusion follow the premises.
Yeah, right? If we have arguments in these structures, we know they're valid. And they're valid purely in virtue of this structure. We do not care what the A's and B's are. That's where the validity is coming in. It's validity in virtue of argumentative structure. Don't care about the things that A's and B's say. Don't care about the meaning. All that matters is that it's got good structure. Good bone structure. That's where validity is coming in here. We're still talking about it. Yeah.
Okay, or the third example, that if is like saying if and only if, or like only if only.
So if and only if's a different thing. We'll talk about it next week.
But like, so isn't it possible to like not B and still A if it's like not all the case in which A is present?
So here's one. If the match lights, then there's oxygen present. What happens if there's no oxygen present? Match can't light, no matter how hard you try. Again, that's just one example. But generally, if you have a conditional like that and you know that the second part's false, you know that the first part couldn't have happened. Here's why. Look at this structure. What does it tell us? It says if you know the conditional is true, and you know that the antecedent's true, the consequent must follow too. That is, A, if it's true, guarantees B. And if A guarantees B, and we ain't got B, well, then we must not have had A either. So here's the argument form I think that you're worried about. I'll put it up here. Here's a bad one. So this we'll just use to express the then. It's an arrow, right? If A, then B. Not A. Therefore, not B. That's a bad argument form. Now, why is that? Well, let's think about what the if-then says. Again, we'll talk more about it once we get our formal machinery, but don't hurt to talk about it now. Sorry.
You can have other causes as well.
Bingo, right? There might be other ways to get to B. If the match lights, then there's oxygen present. The match didn't light. That doesn't mean there ain't no oxygen around. Maybe I just didn't strike it. Right? Again, this is bad reasoning, but that's not what's in that structure. Yeah.
But if we flip it, it's only B to the account.
Yeah. That's what's up here, right? That's that top structure. If we know that the back half's false, front half must be false too. Yeah.
So I'm like not that much confused anymore on valid arguments, but how can an argument then be invalid if it's not important if it's true or not?
I just gave you an invalid argument. Remember, we have a way to tell when an argument's invalid. What would we do to show an argument's invalid? How would we show an argument's invalid? Cool. Good. And in virtue of that definition, how would we show an argument's invalid? What would we need to do?
Premises are true, but conclusions false.
Nice. So we come up with a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion's false. Now it looks a bit funny so far, right? Because we don't really care what the A's and B's say. But don't worry. That's because what we're going to do is we're going to stipulate their truth values. Again, just to spoil what we're going to eventually get to, we're going to list all the possible combinations. every way that this could be, and every way this could be, and every way this could be, and then we go hunting. We find if there's any where those are true and that's false. And if there's even one, invalid. Make sense?
So how can the conclusion not be true if it doesn't matter if it's actually true?
Good. So to rephrase as I see it, how can we be concerned with the truth value of the A's and B's if they don't have any meaning? Is that kind of what you're after? Cool. Here's the trick. We're thinking about structures. The A's and B's stand for full sentences. They stand for them. They are not them. That's why it matters. Remember what I said here, right? We know that this argument structure is good. It's guaranteeing validity, regardless of what we plug in for A and B. So I can fill in anything you like for A and anything you like for B. And then I can say, cool, don't care what sentence it is, suppose it's true. Suppose A is true, and suppose B is true. Don't really care what they are, just suppose they're true. What happens to my structure? That's why. They're basically variables that we can replace with complete sentences. And they can still have values because they're just representations. They're just symbols for the more complex natural language behind it. That's the trick. It's a good question. It's a really good question. Yeah?
So, as long as you're not making you're not making A, B, 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 then everything is fine. Changing it around.
Yeah, as long as you don't equivocate, right? As long as you stay consistent with what you use, you're good, right? But of course, if you cheat, in that sense, well then cool, garbage in, garbage out, right? So again, let's think about what these do. These things are telling us ways to track validity purely by thinking about the structure. We do not care what the sentence letters stand for. They could be anything you want. That sounds real nice. This looks like already giving us a way to start thinking about validity, what we're after. Now let's note a limitation here, and this will kind of come back, I think, to maybe some of the worries we just had. Here's an argument that's valid that doesn't seem to be valid in virtue of structure. Premise 1, the Pope's a bachelor. Conclusion, therefore the Pope is male. Why is this argument valid?
Because the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male.
Yeah, right? So note, in order to assess the validity of this argument, we have to talk about meaning. So here's the trick. We can't do this with TFL, but we will with FOL. We've got to get the first bit with the structure down, and then we can get to a point where we can track something like meaning. We start off walking, get to running. Okay. We're going to set these aside for now. We're going to come back to them about 3 weeks' time. But again, all we're going to be paying attention to, the ones like this, the structures, the schemas. So this highlights a limitation of TFL. It's only going to understand arguments that are broadly valid in virtue of form. It's just about truth functionality. It doesn't say anything about meaning. But that's okay. TFL is our sledgehammer. It's not a finesse instrument. It's the first pass thing when you need to knock walls down. You use the finesse instrument later. So our first formal language is going to be TFL, truth functional logic, often called propositional or sentential. We use it by taking natural language sentences and arguments and extracting the kind of structures, putting them into this highly restricted language. The fundamental building block here are what we'll call atomic sentences. These are, if you like, the one-by-one Lego that everything else is going to get built out of. Atomic sentences can stand alone, or they can be sub-sentences and more complex ones. Unsurprisingly, next week, I'm going to tell you how to build the complex ones. But first we start off with the atoms, in the sort of Democritan sense of atoms, where these are indivisible. They are the basis. Okay. So, let's talk about atomic sentences. In TFL, we express atomic sentences with uppercase letters. You have 26 of them, go nuts. Right? There's no restrictions, anything you like. These letters symbolize relevant natural language sentences. In our case, because I'm monolinguistic, because I'm just an idiot, right? These letters symbolize English sentences. Now note, it's important to say that they symbolize. They are not translations. Why are they not translations?
They have no meaning.
And translations preserve meaning, or at least they try to, right? And we don't care about meaning. We're just symbolizing. Right? So we might map Nathan is hungry to H, Lincoln was shot to S, Yabka's awake or she's snoring. Well, we might map Yabka's awake to A and Yabka's snoring to N. You see how this goes. If we need them, we can add subscripts. This is if we have more than 26 different sentences we need to symbolize. Please, God, let that never happen. But we have them if we need them. Of course, we can't just go willy-nilly. So we'll use guides. In particular, we'll have symbolization keys. Symbolization keys, unsurprisingly, specify which atomic sentence each letter represents in the relevant case. Note, atomic sentence here is actually referring to English. So, what we have in this symbolization key is it's telling us, hey, the capital A is a symbol for the English sentence, Yabka's awake. B is Yabka is snoring, and C is Nathan's hungry. And then we can do our symbolizing accordingly. Make sense? Again, we've got the very basic of our language already. Capital letters, subscripts if we need them. Each capital letter stands for an atomic sentence in English. In English, that's typically just a subject and predicate. Sometimes it can be more complex. But for now, we'll just look at subject-predicate forms. Okay. Good so far? Okay. Let's see. So here's our symbolization key and some English sentences. Let's get started with symbolizing. Jesus, so many S's. So let's try the first one. How would we symbolize Nathan is hungry using this key? Very difficult. How about if Lincoln was shot, then he died? Ooh, well, let's be careful, right? Yeah. If B, then C, right? If Lincoln was shot, then Lincoln died. How about our third one? Yabka's awake or she's snoring. Dearie. Nice. Nathan's hungry and Yabka's snoring. Beautiful. Now, again, here's the big trick. I'm sure this is going to shock and surprise you all. The next move will be to replace the English that we have in this with symbols. I've already given the game away a little bit here. We're going to get rid of things like if then. We're going to replace it with an arrow. We're going to get rid of or and replace it with a symbol. We're going to get rid of and replace it with a symbol. Here's the cool thing. There's a very restrictive grammar. Next week, we're going to actually just define what it is to be a TFL sentence. It's always going to have one of 7 forms, actually 6. The 7th rule is my favorite rule. The 7th rule says there are no other fucking rules. It's the best rule. So, okay, what we just did, this sort of mapping, that's really kind of what TFL is about. We're going to show how we could map English to TFL, and then we're going to develop some machinery that will let us assess TFL sentences, arguments, things like this, or stuff like validity, joint consistency or inconsistency, being a necessary truth or necessary falsehood or a contingency. The whole move is going to be to get it into this, to strip away all the noise, so then we can just see how our machines work. Don't care about the stuff in English, that just gets in the way. We want to figure out exactly whether we have validity in virtue of form. It's always going to be true in virtue of its form, etc., etc., etc. Cool. Before we trundle on, any questions? I know I've already thrown a lot at you, but we're like Sonic, we got to go fast. Yes?
I have a question about the sentence with the quote.
Yes.
But is it invalid according to TFL?
Yeah, it is. So here's a good question. If we were going to symbolize this in TFL, right? In fact, we already have enough to do it. We'd have to do something like one would be, I don't know, let's call it B, and two would be maybe M. And there's going to be a real easy way to show why that's invalid. We can just make B true and M false, and we're done. So this kind of comes back to something I think that was being expressed as a worry, right? TFL isn't concerned with meaning. That seems like it's kind of letting the side down a little bit. And the answer is, yeah, it's limited. It's limited. It only tracks this kind of truth functionality. But it's the place to start. Because you've got to pass this bar to even get into we should care about the meaning stuff. Other than cases like this. Okay. Cool. So what we'll do in the tutorials, which start, I think, tomorrow morning, 8:45, is we'll work through some exercises about the notions that we've talked about here. Generally, the tutorials will be designed where we'll talk about the stuff that's due next lecture. Right? We spend the time in the tutorials working on the homework that's due next week, which makes sense, right? Because it's homework that's about the things that we just talked about in these lectures. I suspect in the tutorials this week, we'll get through all the questions. As we get kind of going, that might not be the case, but we'll do our best. Cool. Any other questions? No? Beautiful. Awesome. So here's the big advantage of what we're doing, right? Is once we start symbolizing in this way, all the messiness of English drops out. We just look at the form. English is messy, TFL is not. Here's the downside to symbolizing like this. English is messy, TFL is not. We might miss out on a lot of nuance. Right? Another way to really draw this out is to note that in TFL, we don't have anything like words. Right? We can't talk about the Pope and talk about things that he is like, because that's just outside of our expressive capacity. We can only make full sentences. That's the kind of farthest down we go. We don't have substantial parts. FOL does, but we have to get there first. Ooh, that's interesting. That should not be there. Basically, this is just to read back where we were. So here's the trick. Next week, we're going to finish off TFL. Teach you the connectives, how to build up the complex sentences. We'll formally define what it means to be a sentence of TFL. We'll talk about the syntax. So please read the next 15-ish pages or so, 16, I guess, pages of the book. It'll talk about the connectives and how to do it. That's what we'll talk about next week. Work through the exercises in the tutorials. Thank you guys very much. Yeah.
Is the book on Canvas?
Yes. Everything is on Canvas.
You also added some exercises.
Sorry, I can't hear you, man. Sorry, just one second. Your man's asked a question.
We have exercises in
Yes, in the book.
You're supposed to do that and give it to you somehow?
So on the Canvas assignments, again, this is something that's talked about in Lecture Zero video, right? I would suggest if you've not watched the Lecture Zero video to watch it. It talks about the structure and how everything works. But all the homework will be put in through Canvas assignments.
Would you recommend that we look at the homework and make as much as we can before the actual tutorial, or should we wait?
I mean, to be honest, with the ones for this week, just rock up to the tutorial, right? Because we'll talk about them. Maybe give them a quick read through and some thinking. Don't do the whole thing. If you have, great, it's fine. I should stress, with regards to attending the tutorials and things, strongly recommend you come, at least once we really get going. It's not the end of the world if you don't come this week. But please do go to the group that you're assigned at least this week. Right? If there's a problem, come talk to me and we can figure something out. But just because you got to figure out who's and what and where. Thanks for coming, guys. Take care. We'll see y'all soon.